In late 1970, the overall U.S.-supported military effort in the covert war in the Kingdom of Laos was floundering. Operation Gauntlet, intended to protect Pak Song and the strategic Bolovans Plateau, and was failing. During the operation, which equipped and trained the needed Laotian troops to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, 6 battalions of the Royal Lao Army military regulars went into action, and on August 31st, the operation achieved only limited success. Although the planned objective would be captured on September 25th, the offensive was plagued by desertions and combat refusals by the Laotians, including an entire battalion that ran from alleged ghosts. Laos appealed to the headquarters of MACV-SOG in Saigon, requesting aid from the highly classified unit. Specifically, they asked for a unit to enter near Chau Vane and disrupt PAVN defenses. Colonel John Sadler, SOG's commander, agreed to undertake the mission. However, none of his cross-border reconnaissance teams had ever operated so deep in Laos, and the target area was 20 miles beyond the unit's authorized area of operations. Operation Tailwind was launched on September 11, 1970, by 3 platoons of Command and Control Central's Hatchet Bravo Company and 2 Air Force Pathfinder teams. 110 Montagnard mercenaries and 16 Americans, under the command of Captain Eugene McCarley, were heli-lifted from a launch site at Dak To to a landing zone in a valley 60 miles to the west near Chau Vane. The distance to the target was so great that the men were lifted by 3 Marine Sikorsky CH-53 Sea Stallion helicopters, and they were escorted by 12 Marine and Army Bell AH-1 Cobra gunship. After being inserted in the target zone, the force advanced deeper into enemy territory, soon making contact with the PAVN squad, which wounded 2 Americans and 2 Montagnards, one of whom was trapped outside the unit's defensive perimeter. Sergeant Gary Michael Rose engaged the enemy while treating and stabilizing the wounded soldier, carrying him through heavy fire back to the defensive positions. The company continued moving deeper into Laos, following a PAVN withdrawal, engaging more PAVN forces, and suffering more casualties. Disregarding his own personal safety, Rose treated the wounded under heavy fire, engaging the PAVN to reach the wounded. The fire became so intense that Rose was forced to crawl from position to position in order to treat wounded soldiers, giving words of encouragement and directing fire of the inexperienced and terrified South Vietnamese and Montagnard mercenaries. Over the next few days, the company marched west and deeper into Laos, fending off incessant attacks from elements ranging from squad-sized to company-sized elements, and they were covered by Air Force gunships. On September 12th, during an assault by a PAVN company-sized element, one of the Montagnards was wounded 40 to 50 meters outside the perimeter. Dodging enemy fire, Sergeant Rose ran and crawled his way to the wounded man, shielding him with his own body while treating him. He dragged the Montagnard back to the company with one hand while firing at the PAVN with his gun in his other hand. When Rose returned to the company perimeter with the wounded soldier, he was sprayed with shrapnel from a B-40 RPG in the back of his leg, severely crippling his foot. For the rest of the mission, he would use a stick as a crutch, continuing to treat the wounded while ignoring his own wounds. A medevac helicopter was later called in to evacuate the company's wounded men, but was unable to land in the small opening where the company was located. Rose stood up, fully exposing himself to heavy enemy fire, and attempted to pass the wounded up to the hovering helicopter crew. However, the intensity of the fire forced the pilot to abort the mission, and the helicopter was severely damaged and crashed a few kilometers away. With the aid of close air support, the company was able to break out of their defensive position, and Sergeant Rose improvised litters for the wounded, who were now over half of the company. Despite his own wounds, he never took the time to eat, rest, or care for his own wounds while treating the others. On the night of the 13th to the 14th, the company was surrounded by the PAVN once again. Sergeant Rose dug trenches for the wounded and treated their injuries, as the enemy spent the night bombarding the company with rockets, grenades, and mortars. Moving from position to position, he exposed himself to PAVN fire once again, encouraging the soldiers and treating their wounded. On the 14th of September, the last day of the operation, after destroying a PAVN base camp, the company was informed by a forward air controller that over 500 North Vietnamese were advancing onto their position. On the morning of the 13th, the Americans overran a PAVN bivouac and killed 54 enemy troops. They questioned why the Vietnamese had not fled the area, but members of the Hatchet Force discovered a bunker buried beneath 12 feet of earth. Inside, they found a huge cache of PAVN maps and documents. They had overrun the entire PAVN logistical headquarters that controlled all of the Laotian Route 165. The forces quickly filled 2 footlockers with the intelligence hull, and Hatchet Force began to seek a way out. As the PAVN were closing in, McCarley dropped off elements at 3 separate, smaller landing zones, catching the PAVN unprepared. Casualties incurred during the operation amounted to 3 Montagnards KIA and 33 wounded, while all 16 Americans were wounded during the action. Supported by gunships, the company moved to a landing zone, setting up a perimeter while each platoon boarded the helicopters as the North Vietnamese attacked from all sides, inflicting even more casualties. Rose exposed himself again under heavy fire, retrieving the dead and wounded and bringing them back to the perimeter. In great pain, he continued to treat the wounded, disregarding his own safety, and when the extraction helicopters arrived, he returned out of the outer perimeter to help engage the PAVN and repel the assault. Sergeant Rose then boarded the last extraction helicopter, delivering aimed accurate fire at the PAVN, which was only an estimated 50 meters away as he hobbled up the loading ramp. Soon after the helicopter lifted off, it was hit by an anti-aircraft round, and its engine stopped at an altitude of 4,500 feet. Rose was notified that a Marine door gunner had been shot through the neck, and he had been rendered life-saving medical treatment to the man before the helicopter crashed, several kilometers away from the original extraction point, that is. Rose was thrown from the helicopter before it crashed, and while still dazed and wounded, he crawled back into the wreckage to pull out wounded and unconscious soldiers, knowing that it could explode at any moment. He continued to treat the wounded until another helicopter arrived to extract them. Upon returning to base, Sergeant Rose was covered in blood and wounds and refused all treatment until the other wounded were treated first. He is credited with treating between 60 and 70 wounded and saving many lives. The efforts of the SOG medic, Sergeant Gary Michael Rose, were considered critical to the survival of many Hatchet Force members. He was recommended for the Medal of Honor for his actions and instead received the Distinguished Service Cross. However, it would later be upgraded to the Medal of Honor, which he would be presented by President Donald Trump on October 23, 2017. And that is Operation Tailwind. What other aspects of the Vietnam War would you like for me to cover? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.